Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I would like to review some lessons that I've learned from about 10 years of research into the impact of obesity on the brains of people with severe mental illnesses. Now, I don't have any conflict of interest. What I'm interested in is biological and clinical psychiatry. And since I'm both a clinician and a researcher, I think I've earned the right to criticize both sides. And I think that, in my opinion, the main reason why brain imaging has had relatively limited impact on the everyday practice of clinical psychiatry is for the most part related to the fact that clinical psychiatry has actually had very limited impact on the brain imaging research. And to be more specific, a lot of the biological psychiatry studies or brain imaging studies are still trying to figure out what are the average biological characteristics in people with the same diagnosis. So in a way, they're doing a bit of a one-size-fits-all approach and trying to identify a prototypical average patient, when in fact, every clinician knows that people with the same diagnosis markedly differ, not only in their symptoms, but also in their clinical course, impact of illness on their life, on their functioning, treatment response, and many other things. And until we kind of acknowledge that fact and focus on details beyond just the diagnosis, we may not be able to correctly name the phenomena that we observe through the lenses of MRI scanners. And to me, it seems more interesting to, rather than focus on the commonalities and try to identify this mythical average patient, it seems to me much more interesting to actually study the differences between people. And to me, one of the most important and interesting questions in the field is, why is it that some people with bipolar disorders show marked brain alterations, whereas others with the same diagnosis actually show no such changes? And I strongly believe that if we can crack that question, we will also receive a key to unlocking the clinical heterogeneity and the differences between people in clinical characteristics. And that will in turn open the door to more individualized, more personalized medicine. And I think that comorbid conditions may be one way to solve this riddle of biological and clinical heterogeneity. We know that comorbidities are more a rule than an exception in bipolar disorders. And I'm not talking only about psychiatric comorbidities, I'm also talking about medical ones. Now, you can easily imagine that if different people with bipolar disorders have different comorbid conditions which affect the brain in different ways, then that will create lots of differences between people with the same diagnosis, and maybe one of the explanations for the heterogeneity of biological findings. Now, one particularly relevant comorbidity in this sense is obesity. And obesity is one of the largest public health concerns generally, but it's especially problematic in people with severe mental illness, where globally the prevalence of obesity in people with SMI is about 25%. But in the Europe and North American countries, it's more like a third or a half of people with SMIs have obesity. And the odds of obesity in people with bipolar disorders are about 3 times the odds of obesity in the general population. So that's a dramatic relative risk increase in people with SMI of obesity. Now, we know this has severe consequences for the medical health of our clients, and is in large part an explanation why our clients have increased mortality and shorter life expectancy. Is also to a large part the explanation for why the mortality gap difference in mortality between people with bipolar disorders and general population has actually grown larger over time. Now, you may say, well, this is not really a problem for psychiatrists. This is a problem for internal medicine. But I think that would be short-sighted, because there's now more and more evidence suggesting that obesity actually affects the very prognosis and phenotype of the underlying psychiatric illness. We know that people with bipolar disorders who are obese tend to have more disability, more chronicity, more pernicious types of clinical course, such as rapid cycling. Obesity is also one of the strongest predictors of increased severity of illness and lower and worse psychosocial outcomes. In studies that were not done by our group, other researchers have also shown that obesity is associated with more difficult to treat index affective episode, greater number of lifetime depressive and manic episodes, lifetime history of suicide attempts, and greater risk of affective recurrence, especially depression, in the future. So I would say that obesity in severe mental illness is undoubtedly and clearly an issue that psychiatrists need to take seriously. And you may be wondering, why is it that a peripheral below-the-neck disorder, such as obesity, affects psychiatric prognosis? Now, my explanation for that is that brain is actually one of the targets for obesity-related damage. And this link was somewhat underappreciated because it was thought that this is simply an artifact of atherosclerosis, but it's not. Obesity is associated with regional gray and white matter alterations, even in absence of or when controlling for cardiovascular risk factors. Now, this has been documented in some of the largest studies and has been replicated across different cohorts. So these are very solid results. Now, you may be wondering, what is it that we know about obesity in people with SMI? And when I got interested in this field, this is pretty much what we knew. So essentially nothing. Now, since then, we've made a bit of a dent in this, I hope, in no small part through collaboration with the Enigma Consortium, where we established a BMI-X working group, which is specifically targeting the interplay between SMI and obesity in their effects on the brain. The Enigma is a consortium of people who like to work together, allows us to combine data that were acquired for other reasons. Now, this obviously generates heterogeneity across the sites, which some people consider a flaw of Enigma. I actually consider that a strength, because that way we're getting a highly generalizable snapshot of what the illness looks like globally, which is very complementary to very narrow and highly defined studies from individual sites. What the Enigma is very beneficial in is reducing the methodological heterogeneity and providing harmonization of the data processing techniques. So through collaboration with Enigma, we were able to put together a sample of over 1,600 controls and over 1,200 cases that were recruited in 13 countries on 6 continents, which is just an astounding fact, and is a lot of fun when we're having our teleconferences across all these sites. Now, I'll be summarizing about over 10 years of research. A lot of this was done by my postdoctoral fellow, Dr. McWeeny. In these large data sets from Enigma, what we found out was that obesity was associated with lower cortical thickness in about 1/3 of cortical regions, including, for example, most prominently, frontal temporal lobes and cingulate gyrus. Now, the interesting thing was, we knew this much before, but the interesting and added thing from our studies was that changes in obesity to a large degree overlapped with changes in bipolar disorders. And now, while there were some unique changes related to specifically bipolar disorders, 90% of regions which were associated with obesity were also associated with bipolar disorders. So obesity is certainly a relevant confound, and not controlling for obesity would inflate the effect sizes for brain imaging changes in bipolar disorders. So this is the first lesson that we've learned from this. Now, this was most prominent in the case of lateral ventricles. And you may know that ventriculomegaly, or enlarged lateral ventricles, are among the most replicated findings in bipolar disorders. What we saw in our studies was that obesity was associated with larger ventricles, and that this obesity-related ventricular enlargement accounted for between 1/5 and up to 1/2 of the association between bipolar disorders and ventricular volume. So in other words, the most replicated brain imaging finding in bipolar disorders was actually related to the presence of obesity. In addition, what we saw in all these studies was an interesting statistical association. We initially were looking for an interaction where the impact of obesity would be greater in people with bipolar disorders than in controls. Now, that actually was not something that we found. In all instances, what we saw that both bipolar disorders and obesity were independent predictors of cortical thickness. In other words, obesity adds to brain changes in bipolar disorders, and people who have both obesity and bipolar disorders will have more pronounced brain changes than people with only one of these conditions. So the relationship between these two is additive. And another lesson that this teaches us is that psychiatrists may actually get a reasonable estimate of cortical thickness in their office simply by measuring height and weight of our patient, which very closely correlates with cortical thickness and ventricular enlargement. Now, an obvious question that comes up is, what does this have to do with the effects of medications? And we know that many psychiatric medications, including antipsychotics and anticonvulsants, are negatively associated with brain structure, and they also are obesogenic. They cause weight gain. Now, the question is, do these obesogenic effects of medications contribute to their impact on the brain? And the answer to that is yes, they do in some regions, where we saw that between 10 and 34% of the association between medications and cortical thickness or white matter integrity was actually mediated by obesity. So weight gain on medications increases the statistical effects of medications on the brain, and that's something that we should take into consideration when prescribing these medications. Now, many people have puzzled about the similarities between bipolar disorders and schizophrenia in their brain imaging findings. Now, these are maps from the mega-analysis conducted by Enigma, and if you disregard the coloring, it would be hard for me to tell you which brains are people with bipolar disorders and which are people with schizophrenia. Now, when explaining these overlaps, people have invoked common genes and common environmental influences, common pathophysiology. But the similarities become even more pronounced when you overlay the effects of obesity. So it is quite clear that bipolar disorders and schizophrenia resemble each other also because of high risk of obesity in both of these conditions. Now, these lessons that we've learned obviously generate a lot of questions that we still want to ask ourselves. A key riddle is the chicken and egg problem. What came first? Is obesity causing brain damage, or does certain configuration of brain make people maybe more impulsive, less attuned to reward signaling, and more likely to become obese? Now, we've tackled this question with one of our collaborators within the BMIX, Dr. Oppel from Germany, using a Mendelian randomization study, where we found that genetic correlation suggested causal effect of BMI on lower cortical thickness, especially in frontal and temporal lobes. So it seems that the perpetrator is the obesity and the victim is the brain. Now, another key question is the structure-function relationships. If what we see are simply brain changes that don't translate into any behavioral or cognitive impairments, then that would not be so relevant or interesting. So what we're now trying to see is whether these brain changes are linked with cognitive impairment and explain some of the cognitive impairment in people with SMI. And we're engaging, again, through the Enigma BMIX consortium. We're engaging with a number of groups around the world, trying to answer this question by adding cognitive data to our analysis. So to conclude, this research has really made it clear to me that psychiatrists should weigh their patients. The reason for that is that obesity adds to brain alterations in bipolar disorders and schizophrenia in key regions in frontal temporal lobe and anterior cingulate. Obesity also adds to negative statistical effects of antipsychotics or anticonvulsants on the brain. And obesity seems to be a risk causal factor for progressive deterioration of brain changes, which is frequent in SMI, but is also modifiable and very easy to measure. Now, prevention of overweight obesity in SMI is highly relevant, as it may postpone the development of brain changes and could improve the outcomes prognosis of psychiatric disorders, which is an area of our future research. I'd like to thank all the international collaborators and friends and colleagues, as well as the core team in Halifax. And if you're interested in our research, you can check our webpage at this link. And thank you for your attention.